9. Bradley Dawson and CHRISTE CHEN. 38-year-old Bradley Dawson and 36-year-old CHRISTE CHEN married in 2022, just 3 months after they first met. At the time, CHRISTE was fresh out of pharmacy school, while Bradley worked as an IT specialist. The couple, who lived in Memphis, were at the tail end of a whirlwind romance when they tied the knot. And as a wedding gift, CHRISTE's parents paid for the couple's honeymoon at the upscale Turtle Bay Resort in Fiji, where they stayed in a suite costing $3,500 per night. During their second night at the 5-star retreat, the pair were seen drinking heavily and arguing at a beach party. According to a witness, CHRISTE was angry at Bradley for flirting and dancing with other women. And when the newlyweds retired to their suite, the loud noise and fighting continued. One woman told People magazine that it sounded like someone in the room was drunk and unable to control themselves. And at some point, guests overheard a loud thud and a scream before the noise suddenly stopped. The next day, a hotel butler entered the suite and encountered a horror scene. He found CHRISTE's beaten and bludgeoned body wedged between a small space between the toilet and bathroom wall. She was clearly dead, and Bradley was nowhere in sight. He'd left his GPS watch behind, but had taken his wallet and passport with him. Authorities found Bradley 2 days later on Matakawalavu Island. To get there, he'd kayaked more than 3 miles, or 5 kilometers, in the middle of the night. Not exactly the circumstances of a leisurely excursion to check out the local scenery. Investigators believe that Bradley was planning to catch a boat to mainland Fiji in hopes of fleeing the country from there. In addition to his ID, passport, and some money, police found some of CHRISTE's credit cards in his possession. Bradley claimed that CHRISTE's death was an accident, but based on the extent of her injuries, police didn't believe him. He was charged with murder and remains behind bars in Fiji while awaiting trial. During a jailhouse interview with ABC News, he described CHRISTE as his everything and insisted that their fights had never turned physical. The accused wife killer told reporters that he left the island that night to give them both some space to cool off. Authorities are understandably having a hard time believing any of Bradley's claims of innocence, and his requests for bail have been denied due to concerns that he's a flight risk. 8. ROBBIE AWAD and MARINA HANNA. After tying the knot in Sydney in June of 2022, 30-year-old ROBBIE AWAD and 29-year-old MARINA HANNA traveled to Australia's Whitsunday Islands to celebrate their vows. But what was meant to mark the beginning of a long life together took a horrifying turn when Robbie lost control of a golf cart he was driving, causing it to roll over. Marina fell out of the passenger seat and was critically injured in the accident. Bystanders attempted CPR, but they were unable to revive the young woman, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. Robbie was clearly devastated by the loss of his wife just days after their wedding. But being grief-stricken didn't spare him from police scrutiny in the aftermath of the tragedy. Following a lengthy investigation, authorities charged him with multiple crimes, including driving without due care resulting in death, using a cell phone while driving, and not wearing a seatbelt. Police believe that Robbie was trying to make a U-turn when the golf cart rolled onto its side. And neither he nor Marina were wearing their seatbelts, which may have contributed to Marina's death. Nearly a year after Marina's passing, Robbie pleaded not guilty to the charges, so the case is ongoing. 7. Chantal Bayer and Sven Fuchs. Assuming nothing major goes wrong, a honeymoon in the exotic wilderness could easily qualify as the vacation of a lifetime. But unfortunately for one newlywed South African couple, things went terribly wrong during a trip to the Aloe Ridge Hotel and Game Reserve outside Johannesburg. 24-year-old Chantal Bayer and her husband, Sven Fuchs, spent their honeymoon accompanying a group of others on a game drive at the reserve. And during the excursion, the couple stopped to look at some rhinos. But just moments after they posted for a photo in front of the giant mammals, one of the rhinos charged at Bayer and gored her from behind with its horn. She was taken to the emergency room with severe injuries, including a collapsed lung and several broken ribs. And she spent the next week hospitalized in the intensive care unit. Bayer blamed the attack on the group's guide, Alex Richter. She claimed that Richter had encouraged her and the other group members to stand near the rhinos for their photo op, and she felt that he should have known that it was dangerous to get as close to the creatures as they did. Richter also allegedly encouraged the rhinos to come closer to the group with food. The game reserve declined to comment on the attack, but continued to advertise the ability to view rhinos at close range on its website. 6. Louis Bennett and Isabella Hellman. The United States Coast Guard is used to dealing with a lot of strange and straight-up scary situations. But they received an especially bizarre call for help in mid-May 2017, when a dual British and Australian citizen named Louis Bennett contacted them from a life raft off the coast of Florida. A helicopter rescued the stranded sailor, who told authorities that he and his wife of 3 months, a Cuban-American woman named Isabella Hellman, had departed from the U.S. on their catamaran several weeks earlier for a delayed honeymoon. He claimed that they sailed to Saint Martin, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Bennett also said that after leaving Cuba for the return voyage to Florida, he asked Isabella to take over the boat's controls for the night while he slept. He was then awakened several hours later when the boat struck something. But when he went up on the deck, Isabella was nowhere to be found. According to Bennett's version of events, the boat began to capsize, so he got on a lifeboat and called for help. But his story didn't add up. When the Coast Guard rescued Bennett, they found a collection of silver coins in his possession that he'd reported stolen a few weeks earlier. They were worth tens of thousands of dollars, but it still seemed odd that Bennett thought to grab them during what he described as a potential life or death emergency at sea. Investigators were also confused by the fact that he didn't have Isabella wear a life jacket or any other safety gear when she took over the boat. Bennett was an experienced sailor, and the events he described didn't reflect the actions of someone with his level of seafaring knowledge. And he'd clearly taken his time packing the lifeboat with provisions and valuables before calling for help, which made it difficult to believe that he was experiencing the level of distress he described. Isabella's body was never found, but the catamaran was recovered. Based on an FBI analysis, authorities speculated that Bennett may have tried to deliberately sink the boat. And naturally, it made law enforcement wonder if Isabella's disappearance was truly an accident. Further investigation revealed that the couple had a tumultuous relationship. They had a 3-year-old daughter together and had recently gotten married in what seemed like a last-ditch effort to make things work amid constant fighting. At the very least, it seemed as though Bennett had acted with deliberate negligence for his wife's safety in a situation where he knew her life could be at risk. But it also seemed plausible that he'd murdered Isabella. After a lengthy investigation, federal prosecutors charged Bennett with second-degree murder. They accused him of wanting Isabella out of the picture so he could live his life as he pleased. They believe that he chose to kill her rather than divorce her because he wanted to inherit her money and assets. But they knew they faced an uphill battle when it came to proving a murder had occurred, and they weren't sure they could meet the burden. Instead of risking a trial, prosecutors offered Bennett a plea deal for a reduced charge of involuntary manslaughter. And in the end, he accepted and was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. To Isabella's loved ones, the sentence was a far cry from justice, and their anger is understandable. But the plea deal seemed like a safer alternative than putting Bennett's fate in a jury's hands and hoping for a guilty verdict in a case that was far from rock solid. At his sentencing, Bennett apologized to Isabella's family and waived his right to appeal. But he's never outright admitted to any wrongdoing. And in addition to his prison sentence, he was ordered to pay his late wife's family nearly $23,000 in restitution. 5. Annie and Shreen Dewani. Annie Hindoka was raised in Sweden by parents of Indian descent who were forced to leave Uganda during the 1970s, when the president expelled all Asians from the country. In 2009, during a trip to London, she met her future husband, Shreen Dewani, a British millionaire. They maintained a long-distance relationship until early 2010, when Annie moved to London. And despite some difficulties in their relationship, they became engaged 2 months after Annie's arrival in the UK. Then, 5 months later, in October 2010, they got married in Mumbai. Following their wedding, Annie and Shreen traveled to South Africa for their honeymoon. They spent the initial days in Kruger National Park before heading to Cape Town. After landing at the airport, they took a taxi to a nearby luxury hotel. And during the ride, they struck up a conversation with the driver, Zola Tongo, who offered to be their tour guide. The couple and Tongo then made plans to meet the next day. Tongo picked them up the following evening, dropping them off at a local restaurant for dinner. They reunited with Tongo after the meal, and while driving through the Gugulethu township outside Cape Town, their car was hijacked by two armed men. The subsequent events remain somewhat unclear, but according to the account given to the police, the carjackers drove a short distance before throwing Tongo out of the car. Then, just 20 minutes later, the suspects robbed Shrien, taking his money, watch, wallet, and cell phone before ejecting him from the vehicle. Shrien later informed the police that he pleaded with the carjackers to release both him and Annie, but they refused, claiming they only intended to steal the car and not harm them. A passerby noticed Shrien in distress on the roadside and helped him call for assistance as the car sped away. The following day, Annie was discovered dead with a single gunshot wound to her neck in the back of Tongo's taxi. And at the time of her death, she was only 28 years old. During the investigation into the murder, various allegations emerged. Two men, Mizwamadoda Kwabe and Zolile Mengen, were identified as the armed carjackers. Both reportedly admitted to their involvement during police questioning, while Monde Bolombo, a receptionist at the Dawanis Hotel, allegedly confessed to participating in the kidnapping. But all three suspects claimed that the killing was unintentional. Further evidence also implicated Zola Tongo in the failed robbery. Initially presenting himself as a victim, Tongo eventually confessed as mounting evidence contradicted his account. The suspects later changed their stories as well, accusing Shrien Dawani of hiring them to murder Annie. Shrien has never publicly addressed his wife's murder, but consistently denies any involvement in the crime. Monde Bolombo, the hotel clerk, received immunity in exchange for testifying against the other suspects. Zola Tongo pleaded guilty to murder in 2010 and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Controversially, he was released in 2022 after serving 8 years and will remain on parole until 2028, causing outrage among Annie's loved ones. Mizwamadoda Kwabe pleaded guilty to murder in 2012 and received a 25-year sentence, while Zolile Mengen was convicted of murder later that year and received life in prison. Prosecutors initially pursued charges against Shrien Dawani based on the defendant's claims that he hired them to kill Annie. However, these confessions were eventually disproven, leading to Shrien's exoneration of any involvement in the crime. 4. Igal Tiesman and Sheer Frankel. In 2018, Sheer Frankel and Igal Tiesman marked the beginning of what they thought would be a lifetime of wedded bliss with a Caribbean cruise on the Allure of the Seas. During a port stop in Honduras, they went on a ziplining excursion. Frankel went before Tiesman and got stuck on the line. But by the time her husband realized that the line had malfunctioned, he was barreling forward at full speed. Igal then crashed into his new bride with such force that he died from his injuries. The tragedy came amid mounting allegations from customers who claimed that they'd gotten hurt on the zipline. Recent incidents pointed toward a troubling track record for safety, marked by faulty braking systems, poor visibility between one end of the zipline and the other, and poor communication among staff members. Several people claimed that they crashed into platforms, and in some cases, this resulted in gruesome injuries that left the victim's muscle, bone, and tendon exposed. Zipliners also reported crashing into each other, often because there were too many people on the line at the same time. In one incident, 15 people got stuck on the line before employees even realized that something was wrong. In a lawsuit seeking over $1 million in damages, Sheer Frankel accused Royal Caribbean of failing to disclose that the activity was run by a separate company and falsely advertising top-notch safety standards. And while the outcome of the lawsuit is unclear, it's safe to assume that no amount of money could fill the hole in Frankel's heart, caused by the untimely loss of her husband. 3. Ben and Michaela McCarivy. 27-year-old Irish language teacher Michaela McArivey married her soulmate John McArivey in 2011. The couple took off from Northern Ireland to Mauritius for their honeymoon, where they expected to kick off their new life together with a relaxing vacation in paradise. But their bliss was cut short just 2 days into the trip, in ways that could be described as a newlywed's worst nightmare. Investigators theorized that she walked in on a robbery in progress and was murdered by the intruders so she couldn't report the crime to the police. They arrested 2 hotel workers the very next day. The McAriveys were hanging out by the pool at their hotel when Michaela told John that she was going to their room to grab a snack. When she failed to return, John was looking for her and discovered that the door to their room had been left open. He then entered the room to find his bride strangled to death in the bathtub. But the defendants maintained their innocence all throughout their trials and were ultimately acquitted of the charges. So to this day, Michaela's murder remains unsolved. 2. Ben and Catherine Moloney. In what friends and family described as a truly perfect day in July 2008, 31-year-olds Ben and Catherine Moloney married at an evangelist church in South Wales. The couple had a promising future ahead of them. Catherine was working as a pediatrician while training to become a general practitioner, and Ben was training to become a physiotherapist. And 2 days after the wedding, the couple flew to the Caribbean island of Antigua for their 2-week honeymoon. They stayed in a luxury chalet at the 4-star Cocos Hotel along the island's western shore and spent the next 13 days enjoying their time in paradise. After eating dinner at the hotel's restaurant on the last night of their trip, Ben and Catherine returned to their chalet and went to bed. The couple was then awakened hours later at around 5:00 a.m. when a pair of armed intruders barged into their cottage. In what can only be described as a truly senseless act of violence, the burglars shot the pair in the back of the head at close range, while making off with a small amount of cash and 2 cheap cell phones. Other hotel guests overheard the gunshots and rushed to the Moloney's aid. But it was too late to save Catherine, who died instantly from the gunshot. Ben was still conscious, but was quickly slipping away. Good Samaritans did what they could to try stabilizing him, but by the time paramedics arrived, he was in a coma. He was flown back to the UK, where a team of specialists did everything in their power to try saving him. But unfortunately, he died a week after the attack. Just a month after Ben and Catherine exchanged vows, they were buried outside the same church. In the aftermath of the horrifying crime, a British team of detectives traveled to Antigua to assist with the investigation. Of the London Metropolitan Police believed that the intruders entered the Moloney's hotel room with the main intention of committing a murder, and that robbery was only a secondary motive. 2 weeks after the double murder, a 43-year-old local shopkeeper named Juanita Anderson was robbed and shot dead in a similar fashion, leading authorities to believe that the same killers had struck again. And a comparison of bullets from each of the crime scenes revealed that both attacks were committed with the same gun. DNA evidence found at the scene of Juanita Anderson's murder traced back to a young man named Avi Howell. And further investigation connected a second suspect, Kenyal Martin, to the crimes as well. Police found gunpowder residue on both men's clothing and linked the suspects to stolen property from the murders following raids on their homes. Authorities charged Howell and Martin each with robbery, receiving stolen goods, and 3 counts of murder. And they were convicted of all 3 murders in 2014, on the day following the 3-year anniversary of the Moloney's deaths. In the end, they were both sentenced to life behind bars. 3 years later, though, Avi Howell escaped from prison. But the next day, he was fatally shot during a confrontation with a police officer. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. 1. Marcelo Pecci and Claudia Aguilera. Paraguayan prosecutor Marcelo Daniel Pecci Albertini made a name for himself by successfully prosecuting numerous high-profile cases, such as crimes involving international drug cartels, mafia-style crime organizations, and celebrities. He was also heavily involved in Paraguay's largest-ever operation against the cocaine trade and money laundering. Marcelo's work earned him a lot of praise among law enforcement and leaders throughout the international community, including the U.S. government. but he also undoubtedly created many powerful enemies along the way. In May of 2022, he took a break from working to go on a honeymoon with his new bride, journalist Claudia Aguilera. The couple traveled to Colombia's Baru Peninsula, a popular tourist area off the Cartagena coast. They were still enjoying their time away from the hustle and bustle of daily life 6 days later when Claudia told Marcelo that she was pregnant. It was great news, but their joy would be short-lived. Later that same day, while the pair relaxed on their hotel's private beach, 2 men arrived at the property on jet skis. One of them approached the couple and shot Marcelo in the head and neck, and afterward, the men fled the scene. People immediately suspected that Marcelo was killed in connection with his work on cases against some of the most powerful figures of the criminal underworld. During his time in Paraguay, he'd relied on bodyguards to protect him. But he went on the honeymoon without a security detail. And it seemed like a safe idea because not even the Colombian police were aware that Marcelo was in the country. But the people who wanted him dead apparently had their ways of finding out where he was. Shortly after Marcelo's murder, authorities arrested 5 out of 6 suspects in connection with the case. 4 of the suspects pleaded guilty to murder and were each sentenced to 23 years in prison, while a 5th suspect opted to plead not guilty and fight the case. And unfortunately, the 6th suspect remains at large. But there may have been more people involved in planning Marcelo's death. The mastermind of the crime has never been found, and it's unclear exactly who ordered the hit. Detectives believe organized crime groups are responsible for coordinating the murder, and that the Brazilian prison gang First Capital Command may have been a key player in the scheme.
14. Londre Sylvester. After spending some time at the Cook County Jail for violating bail on a previous gun charge in 2021, 31-year-old aspiring rapper Londre Sylvester was fitted with an ankle monitoring bracelet and sent on his way. As he exited the facility around 9 o'clock at night, 2 cars pulled up. A pair of gunmen exited the vehicle and sprayed him with an onslaught of bullets. In what can only be described as a cold and calculated case of overkill, Sylvester was shot 64 times, ensuring that there was no chance he would survive. A 60-year-old woman who had just posted Sylvester's bail was shot, but survived, along with a jail employee who was grazed by a bullet. After accomplishing what they came to do, the shooters fled the scene. Known by the stage name KTS Dre, Sylvester was allegedly a member of the gangster Disciple street gang. Police released few details about the deadly shooting, including how the suspects might have known he was about to be freed from jail or what their motive may have been. The case has remained largely absent from the news since it first broke, suggesting that the investigation is still under tight wraps or has perhaps come to a standstill. In the absence of any reports that the suspects have been captured, it's probably safe to assume they're still at large. 13. Genesis Escobar. In what can only be described as a senseless and preventable tragedy, 21-year-old mother-to-be Genesis Escobar put her life on the line in a bid for some quick cash one day in early 2023. It's unclear whether she was struggling to make ends meet or purely out for financial gain, but her reasons were enough to motivate her to get into someone's car and demand their money when she was 7 months pregnant. Shortly after Escobar entered the vehicle in Chicago's Belmont-Gragan neighborhood, gunfire erupted in and around the vehicle. According to witnesses, Escobar attempted to carry out the crime with a handful of accomplices, including her boyfriend, and both parties exchanged bullets, but it's unclear whether she herself was armed. The shooters dumped the dying young woman out of the car into an intersection with multiple gunshot wounds, covered her with cash, and sped off. Escobar's boyfriend allegedly grabbed a handful of the money and ran away, leaving his own girlfriend for dead. Family friend Iris Alvarez, who lives nearby, told News 4 that Escobar texted her daughter shortly before the botched robbery pleading for help. But Iris's daughter was sleeping at the time and didn't immediately respond to the messages. A few minutes later, residents found Escobar in the street, struggling to breathe. Good Samaritans rushed her to the hospital, but neither Escobar nor her unborn child survived. To Alvarez, it didn't necessarily matter what role Escobar played in the crime that was being committed. In her view, only a heartless individual could shoot another human in cold blood. The investigation is ongoing and the suspect remains at large. 12. Diamond Bradley. A pair of young sisters named Tionda and Diamond Bradley vanished into thin air from Chicago's South Side in 2001. The girl's mother came home from work to find a note that was allegedly written by Tionda, stating that the pair had gone to the playground. They never came home, and relatives have long believed that the spelling and grammar in the note was too advanced for a girl Tionda's age, leading them to suspect that someone else wrote it. Tionda and Diamond's disappearance sparked one of Chicago's largest ever searches, yet no trace of the girls ever turned up, and more than 20 years went by without any major breaks in the case. But that may soon change. In a TikTok video that went viral in May of 2023, a woman who believes she may be Diamond Bradley could be seen hanging out with her friend at night near a parked Harris County, Texas law enforcement vehicle. At the urging of her friend, the woman revealed a scar that appears to match the description of a scar that Diamond had when she went missing. She also appears to be around the same age as Diamond, who would be in her mid-20s if she's still alive. It's extremely rare for a missing person to turn up after several years, let alone decades. But the woman in the video appears to truly believe that she might be Diamond. Shortly after the video appeared online, she got in touch with Diamond's great-aunt, Shalia Bradley Smith, to discuss the potential next steps in determining whether she's the missing girl. She then went to an FBI office and provided her fingerprints and DNA for a test, which will soon confirm or disprove her suspicions. The FBI agreed to expedite the testing, and the results could come at any time. While the potential to solve the mystery has brought up renewed hope to the case, it's also dredged up years-old feelings of dread and despair among Diamond's loved ones, according to Bradley Smith. Speaking to NBC Chicago, the great-aunt said that the resurfacing trauma has been hard to process. She described the ordeal of losing the sisters as a living nightmare and said that this wouldn't be the first time loved ones got their hopes up. And they've been let down in the past, making them especially cautious this time around. But as Bradley Smith conceded, the family isn't going to ignore a possible lead, even if it hurts to face the potential of being disappointed again. All they can do now is to wait for the test results to come back. 11. The Great Chicago Flood. Like any city, Chicago floods from time to time, and sometimes it gets pretty messy. But when people noticed fish swimming around in the flooded basements of homes and businesses near the Chicago River in 1992, they knew they were dealing with an extremely unusual and particularly disastrous situation. Unlike the types of floods the city was used to dealing with, the sudden influx of water wasn't caused by a broken main or a conventional case of excessive rain. In fact, it was a bright, sunny day. Nothing even seemed to be wrong at ground level. Yet hundreds of millions of gallons of river water were pouring into Chicago's underground spaces, and by the time the 911 call started rolling in, authorities were essentially powerless to stop it. For the first known time in history, the Loop District was officially closed. Hundreds of thousands of people were evacuated, and they were very confused since there were no signs of a flood or any type of disaster above ground. Electricity and utilities were shut off in the immediate area, causing disruptions in subway service. The area remained shut down for 2 days while experts and crew worked to fix the problem. The source of the flooding was traced to a crack in an old freight tunnel caused by a construction crew who took shortcuts in their work. It took a week to plug up the hole that the water was rushing in through, followed by several days of pumping to get the water out of all the basements. Fixing the mess came at a jaw-dropping price tag of around $2 billion. To prevent a similar incident from ever happening again, the city implemented multiple changes to its underground management policies. Chicago's old freight tunnels fell out of use before the 1960s, long before the flood, and city officials saw no harm in paying no attention to them. The most expensive takeaway highlighted by the expensive disaster is the importance of maintaining the system on some level, even though it's abandoned, and how conveniently ignoring deserted infrastructure can lead to unintended chaos. 10. Brown's Chicken Massacre. One of the most baffling and terrifying Chicagoland murders of all time happened at a Brown's Chicken restaurant in the northwestern suburb of Palatine in January 1993. Just minutes before closing time, two men entered the business and opened fire on 7 staff members, including owners Richard and Lynn Ellenfeld and employees Guadalupe Maldonado, Michael Castro, Rico Solis, Thomas Menez, and Marcus Nelson. 6 of the 7 victims were shot dead, while the 7th victim was slashed across the throat. The murders were discovered more than 5 hours later after several workers failed to return home, prompting their families to call the police. Responding officers found the victims' bodies stacked atop one another in the restaurant's walk-in freezer. It was one of the most horrifying crimes to ever occur in the area, and the public became increasingly alarmed as authorities failed to make any arrests in connection with the case. Retired Palatine police officer Brian Opitz later told ABC 7 Chicago that at least 100 members of various law enforcement agencies were working the murders at the height of the investigation, including state police, FBI agents, Chicago police, and others. Despite the immense resources that were poured into the case, few meaningful leads came until 6 years later, when a piece of chicken with a single bite taken out of it yielded an unidentified DNA sample. 3 years after that, in 2002, a woman named Ann Lockett implicated her ex-boyfriend, James Degorski, and his associate, Juan Luna, in the brutal massacre. Using technology that didn't even exist at the time of the murders, law enforcement matched the DNA sample from the partially eaten chicken to Juan Luna. The suspect, who was a former employee of the restaurant, confessed to the crime during questioning, but argued in court that his confession was coerced. Prosecutors argued that the suspects were motivated mainly by a desire to kill in cold blood. Luna had left his job at the restaurant months earlier on good terms, and while the men did rob the restaurant, it seemed unrealistic to think that they killed 7 people purely for the sake of carrying out a robbery. The jury convicted both Luna and Degorski each on 7 counts of murder. They were sentenced to life in prison without parole. 9. Mary Agnes Moroney. When Catherine Moroney and her husband Michael fell on hard times at the onset of the Great Depression, she wrote to a welfare agency asking for help. Like many Americans at the time, the couple was struggling to support their 2 daughters on meager wages, and they had another baby on the way. The family's address wasn't supposed to be published along with the letter requesting donations. But it somehow got leaked, and a woman claiming to be a social worker named Julia Otis soon showed up at the Moroney's apartment above a Chicago grocery store. She came with gifts for the kids, but Catherine felt uncomfortable when she overheard Otis asking her oldest daughter, Mary Agnes, if she wanted to go to California. Catherine asked Otis to leave, but she returned the next day with more presents. Caught between a rock and a hard place, the young mother gave Otis permission to take Mary Agnes shopping for some new clothes, despite her lingering suspicions from the previous day. Sure enough, the woman kidnapped the little girl. The next day, Catherine received a letter from Otis stating that she had taken Mary Agnes to California and would return her in a month. But that never happened, and the months soon turned to years, and the years became decades. The family failed to find Mary Agnes before her parents passed away, causing a lifetime of anguish that was passed down through generations as they struggled to solve the mystery. Journalists and law enforcement also investigated the case, but only 2 promising leads turned up over the years. And until DNA technology came around, there was no way to be sure if either of the women were Mary Agnes. In 1952, the Chicago Daily News claimed that a young woman named Mary McClelland had been identified as Mary Agnes, who had been missing for 32 years by that point. Catherine could tell that McClelland wasn't her daughter, and DNA confirmed her suspicion in 2008. Another woman named Martha Thompson was ruled out based on DNA in 2018. Answers finally came in 2023 after Cook County Sheriff's Detective Jose Rodriguez inherited the case as part of a renewed missing persons initiative. Authorities and Mary Agnes' surviving relatives now believe with confidence that the girl was adopted to new parents in Florida and raised as Jeanette Burchard. She died in 2003 at the age of 75, and her loved ones were not willing to exhume her body to confirm the suspicion 100%. But DNA tests on living descendants revealed a family link between Burchard's daughter, Terry Arnold, and Mary Agnes' nephew, Don Moroney. Based on the results, the two parties appear to be cousins, making it extremely likely that Burchard was Mary Agnes. As a child, Burchard was told that she'd spend the first 6 years of her life in Chicago before relocating to Florida. She was raised by parents who she believed were her mother and stepfather. At one point, Burchard's stepfather hinted that the woman who raised her might not be her biological mother. She asked around, but nobody in her life knew it to be true, so the news nevertheless came as a major shock to her surviving family members. Meanwhile, Mary Agnes' relatives were relieved to learn that she was loved and treated well growing up. Burchard worked as a nurse for 50 years and raised 3 children. By all accounts, she had a happy, normal life and knew nothing of her true identity. Although Mary Agnes has been identified, questions continue to surround the case, including how she ended up in the custody of the couple who raised her and whether they were aware that she was kidnapped, or perhaps even played a direct role in her abduction. 8. O'Hare Station Crash. It's not entirely unheard of for trains to derail along Chicago's elevated system, which consists of 8 lines and is the second busiest rapid transit system in the United States. According to an NBC5 Chicago report from 2019, 27 derailments had occurred over the previous 10 years. Most incidents are minor, but every now and then passengers are injured or worse. One of the worst accidents in recent years came in 2014, when a train operator fell asleep at the controls and overshot the track at the O'Hare Airport L station. The 8-car train was going faster than the usual few miles per hour the trains typically pull into stations at, but it wasn't going insanely fast. It nevertheless crashed hard enough for the front car to barrel partially up an escalator before coming to a full stop. Between the station and the train, damages totaled nearly $11.2 million, and the Chicago Transit Authority paid out millions in lawsuit damages. 34 people were injured in the collision. Luckily, there were no deaths. The train's driver, Brittany Tyshecker Haywood, told investigators that she'd been working a lot of overtime and admitted to dozing off on the job. Just a month earlier, she'd overshot the tracks at another station, albeit without anywhere near the level of damage that occurred at O'Hare. While she'd previously denied falling asleep during the first incident, it became pretty clear that this was probably the case. A National Transportation Safety Board investigation recommended that the CTA and other transit agencies across the US make it a priority to better address the issue of driver fatigue. 7. Zachary Stoner. Zachary Stoner was a pioneer in the niche journalism genre of gangland reporting, who reported on elements of everyday life in Chicago that the mainstream media usually avoids or only covers from a safe distance. In addition to interviewing known gangsters, he showcased local musicians and other facets of life in his community that often go ignored by the press. His rapport with the community also enabled him to feature interviewees that the mainstream media didn't have access to. Stoner gained a sizable national following on his YouTube channel, Zach TV, where he described his content as Hood CNN. But his blossoming career was tragically cut short in 2018 when he was shot in the head in a drive-by shooting. He'd just left a nightclub during the pre-dawn hours and was driving in his Jeep when a car filled with several suspects pulled up alongside him. At least one of the suspects opened fire, striking Stoner in the head and neck. He lost control of his vehicle and crashed into a light pole and died a few hours later at the hospital. The shooting came as a surprise to many. While Stoner undoubtedly inserted himself into dangerous situations as part of his work, he was known as a peacemaker who generally stayed on good terms with most people. But his content was also controversial in many ways. He often discussed conspiracy theories and allegedly angered some people by interviewing certain rappers. Stoner had even received threats leading up to his murder, showing that there's no such thing as a journalist being on good terms with everyone they cross paths with. As years went by without any announced arrests, people increasingly wondered what was going on with the case or if Stoner's killers would ever face justice. In 2023, the Associated Press revealed that police had arrested 5 suspects in 2018 and 2019, but prosecutors declined to pursue charges for multiple reasons. Citing a controversial concept that's sometimes used in Chicago known as mutual combat, authorities reportedly concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to blame one party or the other for inciting the violence. Under its legal definition, mutual combat occurs when a fight or struggle which both parties enter willingly or where two persons, upon a sudden quarrel and in hot blood, mutually fight upon equal terms and where death results from the combat. Simply put, the law apparently didn't see it as their beef to get involved in. They also noted that the case wasn't viable to stand up in court due to inconsistent witnesses and insufficient evidence. The suspects were released and Stoner's killers remain at large. In recent years, the mutual combat concept has come increasingly under fire as a growing number of Chicago shootings go unprosecuted. Civilians are becoming increasingly concerned as suspects continue to be turned loose after being taken into custody for extremely violent gun activity. 6. LAQUESHA Holmes. 33-year-old mother of 4 LAQUESHA Holmes was tragically gunned down in broad daylight one morning in 2017, less than 2 weeks after being released from prison. According to authorities, she was walking down the street when a man pulled up in a car, exited the vehicle and began chasing her on foot. The suspect shot Holmes 12 times before getting back into his car and speeding away. It was initially believed that Holmes knew her killer and that she was victimized during a domestic dispute. This was later found to be untrue. Investigators uncovered surveillance footage of the murder, but it wasn't clear enough to identify the shooter. As the 1-year anniversary of the crime approached, LaQuesha's mother spoke out to set the record straight. During an interview with Block Club Chicago, Belinda Johnson said that she believes her daughter was lured to her death by a man she barely knew. In fact, she claimed that everyone in LaQuesha's social circle knows who killed the young woman. Johnson said that she doesn't know the man personally, and she declined to provide his name to reporters. The grieving mother conceded that her daughter had spent time in and out of jail for participating in an identity theft ring, but she said she was unsure what the motive for LaQuesha's murder was. Johnson admitted that LaQuesha learned how to steal identities by watching her do it. Neither of the women ever meant to let it take over their lives. According to Johnson, her intention was always to come up with a baseline amount of savings with her ill-gotten funds, enough to survive while she transitioned to making a legitimate living. But the money came easy, and it was a lot more than many jobs pay, and the temptation was ever present. Johnson finally got away from crime following a harsh prison stint, but her daughter was apparently still caught up in it. Shortly before she was killed, LaQuesha told her mum that she wanted to get her life on track and leave her current lifestyle behind. Sadly, she never got the chance she deserved to turn things around. The police confirmed to Block Club Chicago that they're not investigating the case as a domestic dispute, but have released few other details. The killer remains at large, and LaQuesha's murder remains shrouded in mystery. 5. The TYLENOL Murders. Over a week-long period starting in late September 1982, 7 people in and around Chicago died from taking poison Tylenol that had somehow made its way to store shelves. Heavily laced with potassium cyanide, the capsules were undoubtedly tampered with by someone who fully intended to kill people. One lucky survivor, Linda Morgan, picked up a bottle of the painkiller to ease a sore leg. For reasons that she still can't fully explain, the 35-year-old got a bad feeling about the pills. She followed her gut and decided not to take any, and opted for a different over-the-counter painkiller. Linda would soon learn that her decision was life-saving. After learning of the deaths, Johnson & Johnson immediately issued a recall of over 31 million bottles of Tylenol, while adamantly urging the public not to take the medication. The company and police both launched investigations and discovered that the tainted pills were manufactured in 2 separate states, indicating that they were tampered with after reaching store shelves. It's believed that the culprit stealthily removed the boxes from shelves, tainted their contents, and put them back on the shelves without being noticed. Acting on a tip from a bar owner, authorities investigated a 48-year-old grocery store worker named Roger Arnold. According to the tipster, Arnold was a regular at his bar and had recently discussed killing people with a white powder. His behavior had also become noticeably erratic following the failure of his marriage. During a search of Arnold's home, police found instructions for making potassium cyanide. They held him several times for questioning, but never had enough evidence to arrest him. Arnold landed himself in prison on a separate case in 1983, when he went after the bar owner who reported him to law enforcement and accidentally shot someone else. He expressed deep remorse for the shooting from behind bars and died in 2008. Investigators exhumed Arnold's remains 2 years later to obtain a DNA sample, which ultimately proved that he was not a match to the TYLENOL suspect. At one point, a New York man named James William Lewis tried to take responsibility for the poisonings. He mailed a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding a $1 million payment to make the poisoning stop, but authorities ultimately determined that he was trying to get money. Lewis served 13 years in prison for extortion. In 1983, the FBI purposely leaked the location of one of the victims' grave sites and put the site under 24-hour surveillance in hopes that the killer would visit the burial. But months passed without any useful leads, resulting in yet another dead end in the investigation. Besides failing to narrow their sights on the sick mastermind of the crime, both law enforcement and the public at large have struggled to understand what the culprit's motive could possibly be. No arrests were ever made in connection with the more than 40-year-old case, but authorities are still intent on solving it. In 2023, they announced plans to run new testing on evidence in hopes of identifying a suspect through DNA technology. To prevent a similar incident from happening, Johnson & Johnson developed caplets and packaging that are much more difficult to tamper with. In 1983, Congress passed the TYLENOL bill, which makes it a federal crime to tamper with over-the-counter medication. 4. The Chicago heat wave. In what some have called the worst disaster ever to strike Chicago, and one of the deadliest climate disasters in US history, the city was choked by a brutal 5-day heat wave in 1995. According to the Scientific American, temperatures peaked at 115 degrees Fahrenheit, but actually felt more like they were in the 120 range. The heat wave was caused by a high-pressure system that came with low winds, high humidity, and consistent daytime temperatures in the 90s or higher. Even at night, Chicago's residents were unable to catch a break from the scorching temps, which remained well into the 80s. The conditions were extremely unusual for a Midwestern summer and downright dangerous for a dense urban environment where the thick, hot summer air tends to linger in place. To say that the city was unprepared for what came next would be an understatement. A lot of people either didn't have air conditioning or couldn't afford to run theirs, giving them no choice but to languish in the stifling heat. To make matters worse, many residents without air conditioning also kept their windows closed due to fears of crime. As a result, people began to drop like flies, and bodies began pouring into morgues in droves. The first 4 deceased victims were found on the second day of the heatwave. What started as a trickle soon turned into a deluge. By the time the heatwave was over, it had claimed 735 lives. Sadly, most of the victims were elderly and/or poor. Back then, however, a heatwave was hardly considered a climate disaster. Even as the death toll began to rise, then Mayor Richard M. Daley wrote it off as typical summer heat. He told civilians not to blow it out of proportion and accused the media of overhyping the event. In an arguably more cringeworthy statement, Chicago's Human Services Commissioner at the time, Daniel Alvarez, described the mounting fatalities as the result of people neglecting themselves. But the effects of the heat wave eventually became undeniable, and Alvarez eventually apologized for his words. He vowed that the city's leadership would learn from their mistakes to prevent history from repeating itself. But it took some time for the city to make good on that promise, and it wasn't anywhere near as prepared as it should have been when another historic heatwave struck again 4 years later, in 1999. During the 3-day period, Chicago set a new all-time humidity record, with the dew point peaking at 83 degrees. Today, the city's much better prepared for extreme summer heat, which is only expected to worsen in the coming years due to climate change. As part of the Chicago Climate Action Plan, emergency management officials have an emergency protocol in place that clearly specifies when and how to take action in the event of potentially life-threatening conditions. In addition to conducting wellness checks on the elderly and other vulnerable civilians, the plan calls for the availability of cooling centers and buses. It may not be enough for the prolonged periods of extreme heat that seem to only be getting longer each year, but authorities remain dedicated to keeping the response requirements up to date. 3. The murder of Charles Merriam. Amoco oil executive Charles Merriam was at his suburban Chicago home one night in 1987 when someone knocked on his front door. The 52-year-old answered the door in his pajamas and came face to face with 2 men dressed as Chicago cops, who shot him twice in the chest and once in the head. After executing Merriam in cold blood, the killers left the scene. They remain at large to this day. In the days leading up to the shooting, Merriam had become increasingly concerned about his safety. He was implementing some major changes at his local gas stations, which were being converted from full-service gas and repair shops to self-serve convenience stores. The revamped business model put Merriam at odds with Frank Melito, who was Chicago's biggest gas dealer at the time. Fearing for his safety, Merriam had requested protection while visiting his businesses. A year before he was killed, Merriam was approached by federal prosecutors who wanted his help nailing Melito in a suspected tax and mail fraud case. Naturally, this would have only added to any existing reasons Melito may have had for wanting him out of the picture. Melito had strong political and local law enforcement connections, along with ties to the mob, and his name was the first thing that came to a lot of people's minds in trying to solve Merriam's murder. But the case quickly went cold and landed on the back burner before being all but forgotten about. As the 35th anniversary of the crime rolled around in 2022, Merriam's son Ken told ABC7 Chicago's I-Team that his father's murder had been covered up for decades. He accused local authorities of shirking the investigation because the findings might embarrass the police department. After all, the killers were connected enough with the agency to get their hands on authentic uniforms. Ken also claimed that investigators told him that they were pretty sure who committed the murder, but not to expect any charges to be filed. He even said that police told him hitmen were paid $6,000 each to carry out the execution. Sadly, the case appears no closer to resolution now than it did decades ago. Various law enforcement agencies declined to speak with the I-Team, including the FBI and the Cook County Sheriff's Office, but both said they were willing to pursue any new leads that came in. 2. The loop crash of 1977. The worst accident in the history of Chicago's elevated transit system happened in early 1977, when 2 trains collided during a Friday evening rush hour in the city's busy Loop district. At the time, trains often traveled in both directions along shared tracks. Long story short, a train driver overrode stop signals, which operators were able to do at the time, and rammed into the back of another train along a curve. Those who were on the rear train later said that the impact didn't feel major, probably because it was only going about 10 miles per hour at the time of the crash. But the driver continued to apply power, causing the train to keep trying to move forward, even though it was pinned against the vehicle in front of it. As a result, the rear train jackknifed, causing the first 3 cars to fall off the track. The first car landed on a track support structure, while the second and third plunged straight to the ground below. A 4th car dangled precariously off the track's edge. 11 people were killed and 268 were injured. The collision was ultimately blamed on human error. More specifically, the train's operator Stefan Martin reportedly had a poor safety record. While it's unclear exactly what caused him to carry out the maneuvers that led to the accident, distraction appeared to be the main problem. In a moment of panic after the initial collision, Martin pushed forward on the controller, causing the ensuing derailment. Following the crash, the CTA banned train operators from overriding signals without obtaining permission first. In the years since, trains that once shared tracks along the loop have been separated to further reduce the risk of another deadly accident. 1. Tinley Park Lane Bryant Murders. 4 customers were shopping at a Lane Bryant store in Chicago's Tinley Park suburb one morning in 2008 when a man entered the store and announced that he was committing a robbery. He forced the customers and 2 employees on duty into a back room at gunpoint and tied them up before shooting them execution style. The shoppers and one of the workers died. With help from the surviving victim, police created a composite sketch of the suspect who fled the scene after the massacre. They also released a voice clip of the killer, who could be heard ordering the victims around during a 911 call placed by the store's manager. Thousands of tips poured in, but police appear no closer to solving the case today than they were more than 15 years ago. And while the suspect did clean out a cash drawer before fleeing, investigators were never able to establish a clear motive for the crime. After pouring $2.6 million worth of resources into the case and barely getting anywhere with it, they're relying on the public to continue coming forward with information that will lead them in the right direction. Former U.S. Marshal Ed Farrell, who was previously assigned to the case, told ABC 7 Chicago's I-Team in 2023 that he believes the necessary evidence and information for solving the crime is available. But detectives not only have to narrow it down, like finding a needle in a haystack, they need to reverse engineer what Farrell describes as the electronic footprint left behind by those involved in the crime. Based on surveillance footage, he doesn't believe the shooter acted alone. Shortly before the massacre, security footage captured 2 vehicles pulling up to the scene together and then leaving at the same time. Farrell and others are hoping the right tip comes along and paves the way for putting all the evidence into context so that justice can finally be served. A $100,000 reward is being offered in exchange for information leading to the arrest of any suspects.
Would you rather break your foot while on vacation or get stuck staying at an absolutely disgusting hotel with no nicer alternatives nearby? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.